There's been probably over the last, I'd say, 6 months. There's been a couple of incidents that have occurred in Russia. Most recently, about 3 weeks ago, they had as far away as Siberia. They had some unknown persons get into an airfield and damage a very, very sophisticated and unique Russian surveillance aircraft. So I'm not surprised this is going on, given the level of opposition that is coming, that we're hearing about from the Russian population at large.
Yeah, I mean, many people will not even have heard of this paramilitary group, or it seems to be two different paramilitary groups, which are made up of Russian citizens, but Russians that are sympathizing and working on behalf of Ukraine.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And you're spot on with your assessment of it. Most people aren't aware of that. I have to admit that occasionally when I hear of these different groups and you get a new name, it catches me by surprise. I put them on another list of long names of groups that are out there. So this is not unusual. And part of it is disinformation on the part of the groups themselves, because what they want to do is obviously they don't want to get caught, not in Russia. So it's not a surprise. It's classic clandestine work on the part of a partisan group that is supportive of Ukraine.
What do we know about the extent or the strength of these groups and how much they're actually getting backing, support, military equipment from Ukraine?
We know next to nothing. The Ukrainians, I would say probably about 2 months ago, very, very briefly mentioned that they are coordinating with some of these groups. Now, is this like the level of what we saw with the Free French in World War II, with what Britain and the United States were doing and helping them? The Italians and some of the other countries in World War II that had these type of groups. And we simply don't know. And I think that's a purposeful act, a prudent act by on the part of the Ukrainians to protect them and to keep the amount of information very, very limited, other than to let out every once in a while that something is going on.
And of course, what is happening here is that these attacks have happened over the border into Russian territory. Ukraine can say, well, it's not us. We're not actually escalating the conflict. We're not carrying out attacks outside our own borders. But it does, though, send quite a signal, doesn't it, to the Kremlin?
Well, it does, and it makes their internal security situation so much more uncertain. And from a Ukrainian perspective, you want to do that. You want the Russians distracted. You want the Russians having to take scarce forces, scarce resources, and keep them internally in Russia, as opposed to possibly freeing up some of these type of folks and putting them in occupied Ukraine. So this is to the benefit of the Ukrainians, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, presumably Russia will now feel that it has to send more of its forces to that part of Volgograd where these attacks have taken place in order to protect and reassure Russian citizens in the area.
That's right. That's right. It'll be interesting as the days go by. Again, if we can get a better understanding, some better reporting as to exactly what has happened. Although even then, it'll come with the Russian flavor to it. So most likely, it will speak in terms of the Ukrainians, or I'm sorry, the Russian partisans. Although the Russians will blame this on Ukrainians coming into Russia. We'll probably won't know the ground truth on this for quite a while.
Do you think it does, though, perhaps indicate that within the Russian population there is more opposition to the war and what is going on than we hear about? Of course, President Putin has launched this brutal crackdown on any kind of opposition to what he's doing. And as we've seen, the rounding up and arresting of any of those who speak out against him, dismantling of opposition groups, and so on. But are these just some very small groups of people who are allied with Ukraine? Or do you think that there is more sympathy for Ukraine than we've been allowed to learn until now?
Oh, I do think so. I think there's way more sympathy than has been published. If anything, you could look at it as an example when here it is a war, Russia engaged, limited military operation or whatever they called it, but a war that's being conducted against their fellow Slavs. And in June of last year, when they announced the conscription efforts, it's anywhere from 600,000 to 800,000 Russian men left. They walked away. They voted with their feet that they were not going to fight for Mother Russia under these circumstances. So those who were left behind, and they'll stay small. If they're smart, the groups will stay very small, very insular, because they're much easier to protect that way. If they get too big, the word gets out, and then they're going to end up in the gulag.
In the meantime, of course, we've still got these contradictory claims about what's going on around Bakhmut, where there have been ferocious battles going on for months now with great loss of life on both sides. And the head of the Wagner group had claimed that his forces, the Russian forces, were now in control of the city. That was then flatly denied by President Zelensky at the G7. What do you make of what's going on there at Bakhmut, this city that's become such a focal point, despite it not being strategically particularly important?
Yeah, it's neither strategically nor tactically important when you look at it. And Prigozhin's pronouncements have been wrong on at least half a dozen other occasions, even if they took it. That's certainly some bragging rights for Russia. Hey, we've got a victory in Bakhmut. It's going to be overcome by events here within the next couple days or a week. Whenever the Ukrainians launch their offensive, that is going to be the key thing that is going to occupy Russian attention and obviously Ukrainian attention and their friends' attention around the world. It's not, Bakhmut is really, it's nothing. It's proved to be a meat grinder for Russian forces. They've expended an awful lot of manpower and scarce equipment, and all they're doing is they've managed to become the victors over rubble, because that's all that's left of a rather insignificant town in Ukraine.
Yes, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the head of the Wagner Group, is now saying that he'll transfer control of Bakhmut to the Russian army by the 1st of June. But I mean, as you say, after months of fighting, I mean, the city has virtually been destroyed, hasn't it?
It's from what I've seen of the pictures. I mean, it's basically been leveled. There's some buildings standing, but not much, and those are absolutely completely gutted. And what Prigozhin is talking about, turning this over to the Russian army. I mean, he and the Russian army and the Wagner Group have exchanged fire. There's hostilities between them. And this, exchange, when you're under pressure in a combat situation and you're trying to withdraw your forces to be relieved by friendly forces, that's an extraordinarily complex military operation that is best conducted by units that know each other, that are friends, that can look after each other, not by opponents. So if he can pull this off, it would be a minor miracle. I doubt he's going to, and I think Ukraine's going to take advantage of any efforts that the Wagner Group will make to disentangle itself.
As you say, we are waiting for this much discussed renewed counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces, perhaps a renewed offensive. We haven't seen too much evidence of them actually starting just yet.
Sure. And that's actually what the Ukrainians want to do. They want to keep the Russians off guard in terms of them, the Russians, having to keep their defenses fully engaged, keeping them ready to go to repel the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians will go ahead and they'll launch that attack at a place and a time of their choosing. And I think it's probably going to be locally overwhelming and will probably achieve some degree of success. I don't believe it'll end the war by driving the Russians completely out of Ukraine, but I do believe that the Ukrainians have probably got a well resourced, well rehearsed plan. And for the Russians to launch, what we would call this in the military is a spoiling attack. It's when the Russians would know where the Ukrainians are going to attack and then basically attack themselves to knock the Ukrainians off guard. I don't have enough respect for the Russian military anymore to think that they could pull that off. So I think this lies in Ukrainian hands, and like everybody else, I'm very anxious to see where this goes.
Yeah, and we've had those renewed pledges of military equipment and support from the US, the UK, at the G7. President Biden has now given the go-ahead for the F-16 fighter jets to be provided, though it's clearly going to be many months before those can actually be used by the Ukrainian forces. But do you think that was a significant decision? What we heard at the G7, not just the pledge to continue military support, but the US finally giving the go ahead for fighter jets, something that President Biden had flatly refused in the past.
Yeah, he had refused, and of course, a number of the coalition partners there, for lack of a better term, had been pushing that. But quite honestly, I really do think this is a reflection on Biden's part of increased trust in Zelensky. I think Zelensky has promised that he will not expand the war into Russia by using those aircraft to attack deep targets in Russia, and that's Biden's biggest concern. And I think the proof is in the practice, and I think Zelensky and Ukraine have proven to the world that they're following through with their commitments with this more sophisticated weaponry. And this is kind of the ultimate test. And hopefully he won't fail this test, because I don't think it's going to be healthy for Ukraine, Russia, or Europe, or the world at large if suddenly this war got expanded significantly into Russia.